Good evening. I'm Robert Haas with Michigan Atheists, and we would like to welcome you to the premiere of Atheists Speak Up, a monthly show which will feature news, views, and issues in the atheist voice. Our first show will feature a speech by Frank Zindler from the Michigan Atheists State Convention on November 19, 2005, on a controversial new book, Jesus Augustus, by Margaret Morris. Frank Zindler, formerly a professor of biology and geology in the State University of New York system, for many years has been a linguist, senior editor, and analyst of biochemical literature for a major scientific publishing society. Since the brutal murder in 1995 of Robin Murray O'Hare, Zindler has succeeded her in the role of editor at the American Atheist Press. We hope you'll enjoy Frank Zindler's speech from the Michigan Atheists State Convention of November 19, 2005.
Now then, Frank, are you ready?
Yes.
I've introduced Frank a whole lot of times, and I'm always amazed at what I can possibly say about Frank. He's opening our convention this year in 2005, and I'm very proud of that. And I can tell you that Frank is an international renowned science writer and linguist, that he has expertise in over 24 contemporary and ancient languages. You can read more about Frank in your program book. Frank is a nationally recognized authority on the history, mythology, and flaws of creationism and intelligent design, and other pseudoscience accounts pertaining to human origins. And he's the author of several books and just a ton of articles, and many that I've been reading for a long period of time. And I'm particularly proud of the fact that Frank represented American atheists this summer at the 5th annual convention conference. That was the World Conference, which was in India. And I just don't think American Atheists could have had a better representative out there. And I always feel that it's a great honor for us to be able to have someone of Frank's stature coming to Michigan. But fortunately for us, Frank loves Michigan. And it seems like every time I ask, he and Ann are willing to interrupt their busy schedules, hop in their van, and come out to Michigan to share time with us. And so, Ann, honey, thank you for what you do with this too. And now, folks, it's really an honor for me to present Frank Zindler.
Well, thank you so much, Arlene Marie. It's always, to me, a homecoming when I come to the Detroit area. I grew up in western Michigan, in the dunes along Lake Michigan, but Ann's hometown is Ann Arbor, and she knows Detroit very well. So it's really homecoming for us to come back here. I am I am very moved by the fact that this is the 30th anniversary of what we used to call the Detroit chapter of American Atheists. And through various reorganizations, the group has stayed the same even though the legal structure has been altered. And I was trying to think just what kind of analogies to draw, what kind of metaphors to make in describing the history of this group. I have known Henry, I guess, since the late 70s. I guess he was probably going about 5 years here before Ann and I met him. But it appears now in retrospect that Henry Morgan spent about 20 to 25 years with great labor building an enormous and solid pedestal, which hardly anybody took note of at the time. Well, there were a few of us who appreciated what he was doing, but he was working very, very hard to build this enormous base. And then Arlene Marie came along and said, this is a nice sturdy foundation. I'll build a statue on it. And that, I think, is what we are witnessing today. We are looking at a really fine statue, which could not stand had it not been for the foundation that Henry Morgan built. And so I think we really need to give a good round of applause to Henry Morgan and Arlene Marie. I had to change the subject of my talk today. My laptop, it's the only non-Macintosh computer that I have, decided to malfunction as I was trying to finish a PowerPoint presentation, so I never got it done. And this was very last minute, as everything I do these days is. And so I am not able to do the presentation that may have been in the program. I don't know what the program says. But what I'm going to talk about this morning, and Arlene Marie, I have until what time, including questions?
We would enjoy listening to you until 10:45.
Okay. All right. That's a very diplomatic way to put it. What I want to talk about is a new theory of Jesus. And you'll find this perhaps a little bit wacko, but ultimately I will be addressing the subject with complete seriousness. I suppose, like any sermon, I should start with a text for the sermon, and I couldn't find any suitable passage in the Old Testament, and I couldn't find any suitable passage in the New Testament, so I had to draw upon a passage in what I call the almost good as New Testament. And this is from the first epistle of Dumbledore. Okay, some of you have seen the Harry Potter films or read the books or both. Okay, once upon a time, there was a man who belonged to a very prominent English family. So prominent, the family had its own coat of arms. Among the many icons on the escutcheon was the figure of a unicorn. An American acquaintance asked him what the significance of the unicorn was. "Oh, long ago my ancestors used to raise unicorns," he said. "You have to be joking," the American replied. "Everybody knows that unicorns are mythical beasts." "They are not, at least not long ago," replied the Englishman. "Well, what evidence do you have that there ever were unicorns?" "There certainly aren't any today, and there aren't any in any of the museums," said the American. "Well, archaeologists just haven't been looking in the right places. Anyway, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence," retorted the British believer. "I'm afraid you'll have to come up with more evidence than that if you want me to believe that unicorns once existed and your ancestors raised them," the skeptical American replied. "Well," snorted the Englishman, who was quite religious, "unicorns are mentioned in 5 books of the Bible: Numbers, Deuteronomy, Job, Psalms, Isaiah, 9 references in all." The skeptical American argued that you can't believe everything in the Bible, especially not the King James Version. "Well, if there weren't any unicorns," the Brit snapped, "how would stories about them ever have gotten started? It takes a lot of faith to think that the biblical writers were just making up nonsense. If there never were unicorns, why would they make them up? What reason would they have possibly had? Certainly, it is more reasonable to think that there is at least some unicornal truth behind the biblical accounts. Moreover, you can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there never were any unicorns." Well, against such superior logic, there was little the American could do but agree that there probably was much to recommend belief in unicorns, at least in the former existence of unicorns. And they lived happily ever after. Amen. Well, the problem with the existence of the biblical Jesus, the Jesus of Nazareth, is very much the same as the problem with these unicorns of which I've just been reading. There is no more evidence, historical evidence, for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth than there is for the historical existence of unicorns. We have no historical evidence not only for Jesus, but we have no evidence for the 12 disciples or the 12 apostles. There are no eyewitnesses for any of these guys. And we have to keep in mind that at the period in question, the turn of the era, the late 1st century BC, and pretty much the whole of the 1st century CE, current era, there were lots of writers in the Greco-Roman world, historians, geographers, and so on, who would have to have noticed all of these shenanigans if there were any kernel of historicity whatsoever behind the stories that we see in the New Testament. No historians writing before the Gospels were published mention Jesus or the 12. St. Paul, whoever that was, and I'll talk a little bit about a recent theory about that, in his letters in the New Testament, know nothing of any historical Jesus. For him, Jesus is a celestial being, and there's no evidence in his writings that he thought of Jesus as having been walking around in the nearby territories just a little while ago. And we also find out that much of the geography of the New Testament is mythical. There was no Nazareth at the turn of the era, we'll say the Herodian period. I just read on my way to Memphis, Tennessee a couple of weeks ago when I was speaking at Rhodes College, I just read in a popular archaeology journal that excavations at Bethlehem in Judea show no habitation during the Herodian period, but in Bethlehem in Galilee, there were 2 Bethlehems. How many knew there were 2 Bethlehems? Okay, well, a bunch of heathens, I guess. You got to read your Bible. Praise Jesus. Anyway, you see why I like to come back here? People actually laugh when I do things like that. There was a Bethlehem in Galilee, and that was inhabited during the 1st century CE. But anyway, Capernaum, I have shown, was not a real place, and Bethany and Bethpage and Enon and a few of these other places are mythical. So that makes you scratch your head and say, that doesn't compute very well. The Gospels cannot be used as evidence. They're too late, and they are not eyewitnesses. And then, as I show in my book, The Jesus the Jews Never Knew, incidentally, I brought a couple copies that are at the back of the room there, if anybody is interested in those. But in that book, I show that the ancient Jews had no knowledge whatsoever of any Jesus of Nazareth, and furthermore, they never heard of Nazareth, in keeping with my thesis that Nazareth was a mythical place. Jesus and the 12 apostles, 12 disciples, lived their lives backwards, as far as we can see from the literary tradition. The earliest documents know the least about Jesus. He has no birth, he has no childhood, he has no parents. And only the later and the later and the later we go do we fill in all of these blanks about his early life. And then we even have a gospel of the infancy of Jesus and so on, which is one of the very latest of the gospels. Not in the Bible, of course, but that doesn't mean that they're not authentic. Well, no Jesus resembling the Jesus of the New Testament ever existed. However, almost a year ago, I received a manuscript and a communication by email from a woman who, it suddenly occurred to me this morning, lives here in Detroit. And I completely forgot about that fact, or I would have been in communication with her by telephone and would be looking her up, but I don't have her phone number with me, so I can't do it. Her name is Margaret Morris, and she's an Egyptologist. And she wrote a book, which is in the process of being published right now in England, but I've been sort of working with her through almost the last year in advising on different things. But this book is called Jesus Augustus. And the thesis of this book is, on the surface, so wacky that probably, had she not been introduced to me by a very fine biblical scholar whom I respect enormously, I probably wouldn't have even opened the cover. But the thesis is that Jesus was actually Augustus Caesar, the Roman emperor. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever spent much time reading in the area of the historical Jesus, but many years ago, in fact, the late 19th century, there was a theory floating around that the Jewish historian Josephus actually had written all the books of the New Testament, and that it was the Flavian emperors who were behind the creation of Christianity. And that theory is so preposterous that I even satirize it in the book that's for sale at the back of the room. And like so many things, it can't be completely wrong, or can't be completely right either. And what appears to be the case, as Margie, who she prefers for me to call her Margie, as Margie argues, that yes, the biography of Jesus that we see in the canonical Gospels in the New Testament are not biographies of a real person. That is to say, they are not biographies that derive from a real person, but rather they are biographies that were created to apply to a real person. Now, this is a philosophical distinction that I never made in my own mind, and it's been very, very difficult for me to reason my way to that wording, and so I need to spend a few minutes trying to make this clear. Margie, as an Egyptologist, knew that when all the pharaohs took office, when they were crowned as the new pharaoh, they were conceived as being incarnations of the god Horus, who was equivalent to Osiris. Horus was the living, Osiris was the god of the dead. But this cycle kept going, and every time a pharaoh was crowned, he took on the persona of the god. And I say god singular because Horus and Osiris are kind of equivalent. And he assumed the sacred biography of the god in whom, the god that was supposedly incarnate in the pharaoh. And when Margie did further studies outside of Egypt, she discovered that all of the emperors and conquerors and so on of the ancient world did essentially the same thing when they took office. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he had his assistants reason with the Egyptian priests and drew up a genealogy for Alexander that showed that he is clearly in the line of descent from Horus and Osiris and whatever else, and that therefore he was the legitimate ruler of Egypt. And so he was able to gain control of Egypt without any of the guerrilla warfare and resistance movements and things such as we see today in Iraq against our righteous occupation. But you see, we haven't shown the Iraqis that George W. Bush is really descended from Ali. And I think had we thought about that a little bit and drawn up a believable genealogy for Dumbia, we'd have no problems at all. He'd be the rightful successor to Ali, at least in the Shiite groups. Well, anyway, I'm off the... Yes, well, we know that. But anyway, we move forward just a little bit after Alexander, and Alexander is the 4th century BC, or 333, something like that, BC. We move forward now to Augustus Caesar, who died in 12 AD, but became emperor before the turn of the era. He was the man who pretty much completed the conquest of the known world and brought about the Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace. And he was known as the Prince of Peace. Have you ever heard that term before applied to anybody else? Well, actually, Augustus had it applied first. When his predecessor, Julius Caesar, died, or was assassinated, the Roman Senate elected him to godhood, to divinity. They made him a god posthumously. There's sort of an embarrassment there, I think, but you know, a dead god is kind of an odd thing to think about. But anyway, he became a god after he died, just like Mormons do today, by the way. That's all Mormons become gods, Mormon males, excuse me, after they die, and they have their own planet, and you know all about that. And all the wives they need. So, my train of thought just got derailed here. Let's see. Okay. Julius Caesar became god after he died. Augustus Caesar, however, managed to become a god while he was still alive. And this fact is not generally known. I mean, scholars, of course, know this, but I don't think it's really that much common knowledge. I'm just curious, how many of you knew that Augustus Caesar was elected god while he was alive?
Well, he was not recognized as God in Rome. But he was
Right.
recognized as God in the province.
Yes, very good. Boy, he knows his history.
Claudius.
Yes, yes.
Historical knowledge.
Right. He belatedly became god even in Rome, but you're right, in the provinces. And he, okay, here everything is flooding into my head at once, how to try to sort this out sequentially. When he was elected god, he immediately set about having temples erected to himself. And the greatest and the first of these temples appears to have been the one in Caesarea, in Palestine, in Galilee. And the actual city itself of Caesarea was built by Herod the Great. And the name Caesarea means it was dedicated, it was devoted to the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. And the most prominent position in the city of Caesarea, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, was a platform on which a temple was erected, equal in size to the Parthenon. And this temple was dedicated to the Divus Caesar, to the god Caesar, to Augustus. It was called Sebastos, which is the Greek equivalent of Augustus. And Herod was himself the high priest of Caesar. Now, worship and sacrifices and all this sort of stuff was going on right there in Galilee to the god Caesar. And the point that Margie makes is that in order for Augustus to be recognized as God and accepted as God and ruler in Palestine, he had to somehow make up a biography and a genealogy of himself that would fit the situation in Palestine, especially fit the circumstances of the Jews. And To do this, they composed a Davidic genealogy for Augustus, and they showed that Augustus was indeed the Messiah that was being awaited by the Jews. And in his biography, they had him completing all of the prophecies that were supposed to say what the Messiah would do when he came. And in this case, it was pretty easy because he really had done many of these things. He had brought about a world of peace. He had conquered everybody. He was literally a king, and everybody was expecting the Messiah to be a physical conqueror, somebody who would be a physical king, not some metaphorical king of the clouds, but somebody who really would be setting the world in order. And so he was theoretically a perfect candidate for Messiah. Now, when Margie told me this, and I read her manuscript, I was struck by something that I'd known for years and years, and something that she had not known, and these two things came together very beautifully, I thought. And what this was the following. I had known for a long time that the first use in Greek of the word which we translate as gospel, euangelion in Greek, that the first gospel ever, in the sense that we use the word today, the first gospel was applied to Augustus Caesar. And there were missionaries spreading the gospel of Augustus throughout the Mediterranean world. And there are inscriptions. There's one inscription from Priene of 9 BCE, which refers to Augustus as the soter. This is the savior. He was the savior of the world. And all of the crucial Greek vocabulary that we find referring to Jesus in the Gospels and in the Pauline letters, all of these code Greek terms are to be found in this inscription in Priene. And Margie did not know that, and she, of course, knows it now, and this was just incredible independent support for her thesis. Now, I can't really go through all of the details and the arguments. Her manuscript is enormous. And there's a lot of stuff that has to be thrashed out yet. But I think she really has stumbled upon something. I am in the process of trying to check all of her references. Mostly what I am doing now in the moments that I have to do research at all is going through everything that is known of the cult of the Caesars. And keep in mind, all of the Caesars up until at least Hadrian, up until, well, maybe even up until Constantine, they all became gods. And the worship then sort of accumulated from Julius Caesar to Augustus Caesar and so on, all the way up. And hallelujah, here's Spike Tyson. It's really good to see him. He was in Washington and was a key player in the Atheists in Foxholes demonstration. So I'm so glad he's here. But I want to back up a little bit and defend myself. It appears that I am making a paradigm shift now in my own views on Jesus. And how do I defend it? And I'll just repeat what I said earlier. When I said Jesus did not exist, I was thinking only in the sense that there was no person from whom the biography in the New Testament is derived. That is, it wasn't somebody did something and then that story grew into the biography that we see, or the biographies that we see in the New Testament. So I still say I was correct in that. But what had never occurred to me was that there could be the opposite thing. Namely, that there could be a biography that was created pretty much out of whole cloth to be applied to somebody who was an actual person. And again, to summarize Margie's explanation, every ruler in the ancient world, including the Caesars, upon accession to the throne, had to assume the biography of the tutelary god, who this person was supposed to embody. In the case of the Caesars, and specifically in the case of Augustus Caesar, he was supposed to assume the persona and the biography of the god Apollo, the sun god. And it is interesting, and here was one other thing that I knew that Margie didn't know, and now she's incorporating. Excavations under the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, quite a few years ago, unearthed the remains of a great mosaic, a tile mosaic, depicting Christ as Helios, the sun god. Helios is the Greek equivalent of Apollo. Of Christ Helios with the solar corona on his head, driving the chariot of the sun with the horses and so on through the sky. And it's very clear to me that at the earliest stages, Christianity was a solar cult, which is appropriate if it was the cult of the Caesar, who was the embodiment of the sun god. And so consequently, we have worship being on the sun's day. We have the birth of the god being on the date of the birth of the sun god, namely December 25th in the old calendar, the Julian calendar. This was the winter solstice, of course. With the change to the Gregorian calendar, I think you all know the date of the solstice changed from the 25th of December to the 21st. But in the old calendar, it was the 25th, was the winter solstice generally, and that is when the sun god was born. The earliest costumes of the Christian church, the Catholic Church, were precisely those of the cult of Apollo and of Mithra. The Mithraic religion was adopted by the Roman legions, and Augustus was initiated into several of the mysteries, and he became the Pontifex Maximus, which is the title that the Pope today has, of the Roman religion. And in a sense, he became the chief priest of the religion of the Romans. And all of these costumes, the mitre that the bishops wear and all these things, were part of the trappings of that cult. And we, I think, have a great deal of evidence to show now that Christianity began as a solar cult, as a solar religion, and the reason it did was because that was the cult of the Caesar. That was the cult that Caesar himself was in charge of. I'm going to skip a bunch of things here. One other thing that I should tell you about Margie Morris's theory, and this is one thing that I personally have not had much time to deal with, but the evidence that she's adduced is pretty convincing to me. She finds that St. Paul, whoever he was to be excavated from the letters of the New Testament, as you know, many of those letters attributed to Paul are forgeries. They are pseudepigraphous, not really by the same person. But anyhow, there probably is some kind of a core of somebody in the oldest of those letters. And the question is, who was he? And she identifies him with Apollonius of Tyana, who was a philosopher whom we have reasonable cause to think was historical, but a biography was written of him which is pretty fabulous, and it attributed all kinds of miracles to him, all the same miracles practically that have been attributed to Jesus were also attributed to Apollonius of Tyana. Other than saying he lived in the 1st century, it's pretty hard to know what the dates of his life might have been. But as a rough approximation, the timing works out. What drew Margie's attention to Apollonius of Tyana is that, like the Apostle Paul, he is said to have undergone extensive travels in the Mediterranean world. And the curious thing that Margie discovered is that he went to all the same places that the Apostle Paul did. Not only that, he went to all those places in the same sequence as the Apostle Paul. And so she thinks that he probably became conflated with the tradition of Paul. Now, the working out of the names and so on, this is a little bit sticky at the moment, and we really don't know what to make of it. I want to digress now from Margie's new theory to remind you of a few of the things that I always like to talk about concerning the historical Jesus and the turn of the era, the new era. I said that the Jews were expecting a Messiah. However, the Romans were expecting a Messiah even more than the Jews were. The Roman poet Virgil, as you know, he wrote the epic, the Aeneid, which turns out to be a paean, actually, to the god Augustus Caesar. Augustus was, I guess, a pretty good friend of Virgil, and Virgil was very sycophantic. He wrote all these flattering poems and so on for the emperor. He was, I guess, maybe a toady, but a damn literate one, I'll tell you. And he also wrote other kinds of shorter poems, some of which were called eclogues. And one of these, the so-called fourth eclogue, describes the birth of the wonderful child. And let me just read this to you in English. Now is come the last age of the song of Cumae. Cumae was where a sibyl, a prophetess, was stationed. And the Sibylline oracles, these were hexameters, statements that these old women supposedly wrote. I don't know who really wrote them, but anyway, maybe old women did write them. But they were collected into books, sort of like a collection of horoscopes. And these are collected into books. And the Sibylline oracles were the first non-Old Testament scriptures that the Christians ever used. In fact, the Catholic Mass for the Dead, the Dies Irae, you know, that fire and brimstone section of the funeral Mass, says, Teste David cum Sibylla. In other words, this is what not only the prophecies and the Psalms of David are predicting, but the Sibyl says this as well. And so we still have that pagan thing in Catholicism. It's fascinating. Well, now has come the last age of the song of Cumae. In other words, the end of an age is thought to be coming about. The great line of the centuries begins anew. So a new cycle of ages is starting. Now the virgin. And so this, of course, would be the astrological sign, which is the opposite of... what is Virgo the opposite of? Yeah? Yes, exactly. Yeah, of course, Pisces, certainly. Because the age of Pisces is about to start. And let me hold off on that for just a few seconds. If I forget it, please remind me. The reign of Saturn returns. Saturn, we celebrate, the Jews celebrate their holiday on Saturn's Day, remember? Saturday is Saturn's Day. So Saturn and Yahweh were equated in the ancient world. And so in some sense now, the age of Yahweh is returning. So you see this equivalent here that's being made between Jewish mythology and Roman mythology. We're tying the two together in this Sibylline, in this poem of this fourth eclogue poem of Virgil. Now a new generation descends from heaven on high. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Hallelujah. Only do thou, pure Lucina, this is the goddess of childbirth, smile on the birth of the child, under whom the iron brood shall first cease, and a golden race spring up throughout the world. Thine own Apollo now is king. It says he shall have the gift of divine life. And of course this is all referring to Augustus. Shall see heroes mingled with gods, and shall himself be seen of them, and shall sway a world to which his father's virtues have brought peace. So we have this idea of the Father God and Augustus Caesar as the living God. There are just so many parallels here that make it seem now to me that Margie's theory is probably correct, but there's an enormous amount of stuff we've got to fill out. Now back to Pisces. And I'll use this to end the formal part of my talk. About 100 years, 127 or something like that, before the turn of the era, the Greek philosopher and astronomer Hipparchus of Rhodes, looking at ancient records from Babylon, discovered that the point in the sky where the vernal equinox would be, that's the position of the sun against the fixed stars, so to speak, at the time of the vernal equinox, the spring equinox, he discovered that the equinox, the equinoctial point, had moved from Taurus, the constellation Taurus, into the constellation Aries. And in fact, by the time he figured this all out, it had almost moved out of Aries into Pisces. Now, the Greeks tended to apply, to solve scientific problems by attributing things, unknown powers, to gods. It would appear that the celestial sphere had been moved, had been rotated. It had precessed. And the only thing that could move the whole celestial sphere to cause not only the poles to wander, but to cause the vernal equinoctial point to move from Taurus into Aries and then into Pisces, the only thing that could do that would be a god. And apparently the god that was chosen was the god Mithra, because the constellation Perseus is just above Taurus when you're looking up at the sky. And so it was fancied that a Persian, and this Perseus would be Mithra, had slain Taurus, the bull, and we now were in the age of Aries. And so the chief icon of the Mithraeus was a picture of Mithra slaying the bull, the so-called Taurobolium, and they had a baptism in blood. Are you washed in the blood of the bull? This was a hymn that I'm sure they must have sung. Then, when the equinox moved out of Aries into Pisces, we had to have another sacrifice. Now, Aries is what? The ram or the lamb or the sheep. Let's say lamb. It sounds nicer. So, we have to have a new sacrifice. We're not going to be sacrificing a bull. That's just a bunch of bull, right? So, we will sacrifice a lamb. We have the sacrificial lamb. And the symbol of the new religion will be originally the same as the symbol of the astrological sign that represents it, namely the fishes. And I was quite amazed when I started looking into the details of Christian archaeology, finding a whole bunch of earliest known Christian tombstones in Cappadocia, which is part of what is now Turkey, that they have not a fish on each tombstone, but two fishes. And under the Vatican, you find the two fishes again and again in the catacombs, the Roman catacombs, and so forth. So the astrological sign of Pisces clearly was the thing for the origin of the fishes, the fish symbol in Christianity. And that was how Christianity got its start. Well, I've rambled, I'm afraid, quite a bit towards the last here, trying to get the essentials in, so that we have a few minutes anyway for questions or criticism.
You were talking about the symbol of the fish. Years ago, I read a book by Renee Tannehill, I think is the correct pronunciation of her name, in which she traced, in her mind at least, the history of the fish symbol back to the days in which it was actually standing upright, if you will. And it was the symbol for the temple prostitutes. Do you know about that? And can you comment on that?
Yeah, I have read that. I've read that book, and I've read quite a bit of commentary on it over the years. Symbolism is a very, very difficult thing. It's very elusive. It appears that multiple symbols evolve and may evolve into the same final symbol. Just as in language, different words may be originally very different in their pronunciation, and they ultimately turn out to be homophones, like two, and two, and things like that. And I think symbols do the same thing. In the case of the Christian use of the fish symbol, I think my argument is the correct one. I see this connection directly from the astrological signs of the fishes, and as far as I know, the astrological constellations were never thought to be the vulvas of temple prostitutes or something like that. But, I mean, it doesn't mean it's impossible, but I just don't know any evidence of that. I think that there may have been some other cults at the turn of the era that had some temple prostitute connection, and that these perhaps became incorporated into the Holy Roman Catholic Church. The word Catholic, means for everyone, for all, for the whole, for the totality. And it involved a bringing together of a whole bunch of different cults under one basic leadership. And so there was a lot of censoring and changing of different texts, and okay, well, if you drop that gospel, we'll let you have this one, and so on. So I think there may have been some fusion with such a cult. However, I don't have any particular evidence of that specific cult. But I think there is good evidence that that symbol did ultimately become a fish also. So it's just that in the case of the Christian specific case, I don't think that's where it came from.
My question is, well, you mentioned the idea that Flavius Josephus, a theory that Flavius Josephus made up the entire gospel, and that, are you familiar with a book by Abelard Reichland, which said that Flavius Josephus and one of the Calpurnius Pisos was...
Yeah, in fact, that is what I kind of satirize in my book.
Reichland, you mentioned it by name, though.
The idea was that's advanced by that, and they even have a prize to somebody who can disprove it. It's an interesting thing. This society still exists. I guess it's called the Reichland Society.
I'm not sure.
I'm not.
It's the thing that strikes me about it is that it's advertised in all kinds of free thought publications. It says, scholarly work proves that Jesus never existed. But then when you read it, he gets into such numerological gobbledygook to support it.
Exactly. And this was precisely my reaction to that when I read that book. As again is so often the case, I now think that Reichland was onto something. It's just that he came up with probably the wrong conclusion.
Yeah, or just terrible what he used for evidence.
For example, all this numerology stuff. But I hasten to add, though, that we now know well, not now, we've known for over 100 years, that many of the holy books from the turn of the era or earlier indeed were composed with numerology in mind. These people were really into any kind of divination, the Gnostics and so on. And so they may very deliberately have put all sorts of numerological clues into their writings. So I wouldn't dismiss that just reflexively. But as a scientist, we have to have some more evidence to show that that's a reasonable idea. The problem with that was that he claimed that a single person had written the entire New Testament. That was the claim. So that would include the Pauline epistles, the Epistle of James, all four canonical Gospels, the Book of Revelation, the whole Geschmutz.
Some of the Apocrypha.
And, well, maybe that, I don't know. I don't remember them mentioning that in that book, but if you've read it recently, maybe you remember it better than I do. But the problem with that is anybody who reads the Greek texts of all of these things sees so clearly they cannot be written by the same person. You know, when we see, for example, that the authors of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew pinched the whole Greek text of the Gospel of Mark, the part that's from Mark and the part that's from other sources, these just stick out like sore thumbs. I mean, you can just tell right away they weren't written by the same person. And in the case of the Pauline epistles, it's a little bit more difficult, but some computer studies have been done to show phrase length, word length, average, all these kinds of things that nobody consciously would be thinking of, but would be certainly part of everyone's style. Computer studies show that only a couple of the Pauline epistles seem to have the same mathematics inherent in the style, and then the others are different. So that was what really made me think that that theory was not correct. Okay, are there other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the mosaic that was discussed.
Yes, the mosaic.
Has that led to any further discussions within Catholicism or within any other than this book or any like these two, whatever?
The question is, has anyone else referred to that mosaic? That might be part of Margie's theory. Well, Margie, of course, is following up on it, yes. Interestingly, that mosaic in color shows up as the dust jacket and things like that on a variety of books that have been published in the last 15 years or so, and nobody ever made the connection. And I didn't make the connection until I read Margie's book. So it's, you know, the kingdom of heaven is at hand already. You know, here it is, and nobody knew it. It's okay. Is my time up? Well, so far as I know, only Margie Morris at this point and I are talking about Augustus in that connection. Thank you very much.
That was Frank Zindler's speech from the Michigan Atheists State Convention on November 19, 2005. We would like to welcome you to our monthly brunch held the first Sunday of every month at Denny's, located in Westland on 7725 North Wayne. The brunch starts at 2 in the afternoon. We also meet on the third Sunday of most months at the China Star Palace on 270 South Wayne, also in Westland. Festivities begin at 3 p.m. and often include a featured speaker. For more details, see our website at www.michiganatheists.org. We hope you enjoyed Frank Zindler's speech, and we'll tune in next month for the next edition of Atheists Speak Up.